This psalm has been described as the saddest of psalms. And up to a point you might think that's true, but I'm going to suggest to you this evening that it is in fact a psalm from which we can gain a great deal of hope and encouragement. We're clearly in the company of a man who has immense problems, but we're also in the company of a man who doesn't lose his faith, and that will come out as we progress. Before we look at what we have as verse 1, just a brief word about the introduction. And we starts off with we have the Mahal, the Lano, and the mascul of Heman, the Ezrahites. So Mahal speaks of sickness, and that is perhaps a clue as to what's going on in this psalm. You might like to think that it's the psalm of a man suffering from leprosy. There's no direct evidence that that is the case, but it does seem to fit some of the verses if you think along those lines. I'll leave that there as it is. The word lianoth means to afflict or to chasten oneself, and we can see how that's exactly what's going on in this psalm. Although the psalmist isn't afflicting himself, so to speak, but he regards himself as being afflicted. If you just look at the middle of verse 7, thou hast afflicted me with all thy waves. So he's conscious of his immense difficulties, and he sees very little way out. The word mascul simply means instruction or intended to teach. But interestingly, that title in the Psalms comes 13 times. And so we might look towards the fact that it's something to do with sin and rebellion. And if just keep a marker in Psalm 88, we'll obviously come back there. Just come back to Psalm 32, for example. Psalm 32 and verse 1. Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Now, clearly, it's about forgiveness and covering of sin, but nevertheless, the sin and the transgression was there in the first place. So we can see the sin and the transgression. That's just one example. There's obviously 13 of them, but we'll leave that on one side for now. Heman simply means faithful, but Ezrahite, we read there's Heman the Ezrahite, and we might suppose at a glance that means he was descended from someone called Ezra. That's not so. It means he was descended from somebody called Zerach, or as the authorised version has, Zerah. Now just come with me, please, to 1 Chronicles in chapter 6. 1 Chronicles 2, that's better, and verse 6. And we read there, and the sons of Zerah, well, that's the Ezra bit of the Ezrahite. That's, the sons of Zerah, Zimri and Ethan and Heman. Now, we haven't come across Ethan yet, but we've certainly come across Heman. Just bear in mind, we have two sons of Zerah, who are therefore Ezrahites, who are called Ethan and Heman. Okay, just keep that with you. And then just glance at Psalm 89, and the heading there is a mascul of Ethan, the Ezrahite. So in these two psalms, it would appear they're written by two brothers, Heman and Ethan, both Ezrahites or descendants of Zerah, from 1st of Chronicles. And what fascinates me is that there's a fantastic difference in the approach of these two men. In Psalm 88, we have a man who is, for want of an expression, at the end of his tether. All he can see is his difficulties. We'll come across them as we progress. But in Psalm 89, his brother Ethan has a completely different outlook. Just look at verse 1. I will sing of the mercies of Yahweh forever. With my mouth will I make known thy faithfulness to all generations. For I have said, mercy shall be built up forever. Thy faithfulness shall establish the very heavens. And so it goes on. There's a mixture of the words of Ethan and the words of Yahweh, which is not our subject, so we'll leave it there. But the difference between the two is quite remarkable. So, into verse 1 now, Yahweh, the God of my salvation. So here's a man who has his difficulties, but he still regards Yahweh as the God of his salvation. And we notice that he attributes all of his difficulties to the Father. Middle of verse 5. Whom thou rememberest no more. Verse 6, thou hast laid me in the lowest pit. Verse 7, thy wrath lieth hard on me. Thou hast afflicted me. Verse 8, thou hast put away mine acquaintance. And so you can go on all the way through the psalm. And you can see that here is a man, yes, in desperate straits, but he acknowledges that everything that has happened to him is in the hands of the Father. And as a result of this, he can pray, as we saw in verse 1, I have cried day and night before thee. Second half, the middle of verse 9, Yahweh, I have called daily upon thee. And in verse 13, but unto thee have I cried, O Yahweh. So here's a man who doesn't say, well, I've got all these massive problems, therefore I'm going to give up. And that's where I think the encouragement comes from. Yes, he's a man with difficulties, but he places everything in the hands of the Father. It's a little bit like Job and his three friends. Job and his friends all acknowledge in the book of Job that everything that happens to Job is in the hands of the Father. And Job himself says all his calamities are of God. But Job protests his innocence. Heman did no such thing. It's quite a contrast between the two. Heman lays out his case in his prayers and his crying night and day. And here's the exhortation. He then leaves it in the hands of the Father. He doesn't say, I've got all these problems, and please can you do this, this, and this, and this. He just lays it out to the Father and leaves it at that and waits for the Father's response. So there's a tremendous exhortation there. But still in verse 1, he says, I have cried day and night before thee. And as we just looked at, that word comes in verse 9 and verse 13. But it means to shriek or to cry out. This isn't a man who's quietly saying his prayer to himself and expressing his thoughts to God in some sort of quiet and logical manner. He is shrieking, he's crying out. And in verse 2, the word cry there means much the same. It is to cry. Such is the depths of the anguish that this man is in. Then in verse 2 we read, incline thine ear unto my cry. Now that, of course, can't be literal, can it? We cannot imagine that God sort of bending his ear like this to hear what's being said. That's clearly absurd. But it indicates the desire of Heman to be heard. So he isn't just crying out and making as much noise as he can because he's in great anguish. He really wants to be heard because of the difficulties that he is in. But we have to remember, of course, that our Heavenly Father knows anyway. He doesn't need us to tell him what's wrong. But it's that communication that is so important. It's putting our lives and our trust in the hands of the Father that's important, and expressing that in prayer. And he will, of course, respond. And notice the link between verses 2 and 3. Incline thy ear unto my cry, for my soul is full of troubles. And we'll see this all the way through. This is a man who's really desperate. He's full of troubles. And trouble here means to be, quite literally, it's bad or evil. His life has turned bad or evil. And he attributes it all to the Father, as we've already said. Interesting word. Just look at Genesis in chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6 describes the terrible wickedness upon the face of the earth before the flood. And in Genesis 6 and verse 5, the word that we have in the psalm is translated as both as wickedness and as evil. And so Yahweh saw the wickedness of man, that it was great in the earth. Every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So the wickedness and the evil of man is described in that verse. And Heman uses exactly the same word here. My soul is full of troubles, this evil. So we can see how things are really, again, for want of an expression, getting on top of Heman. But he doesn't give up. In verse 4, we read there that I am counted with them that go down to the pit. So he feels as though he's about to die, those who go down to the pit. And counted isn't just, well, I think he's going down to the pit. There's more to it than that. It means to weave or to plot or to contrive. So Heman's view is that God is contriving to bring him down to the pit. Such is this man's desperate state of mind. Just look at Genesis 50 and verse 20. Genesis 50 and at verse 20. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring it to pass, as is this day, to save much people alive. So God meant it for good. He, if we can use that expression, he contrived the affairs of Egypt and of Joseph for the good of his people. So there was a plan, and God was working to that plan. So just bear that idea in mind and then come back into our psalm. I am counted. It is contrived. There is a plan for me to go down into the pit. So he regarded the fact that Yahweh was against him. And he says, I am as a man that hath no strength. And the word man is giber. It's the mighty man. So there's a contrast, isn't there? He says, I am a mighty man that hath no strength. Why has he got no strength? Because of his troubles. And those troubles have sucked his energy out of him, even though, presumably, he was a mighty man. And he could be a mighty man if only he didn't have these difficulties pressing down upon him. And he says then in verse 5 that he is free among the dead. Of course, he can't literally be dead because he's written the psalm. So this is another expression of the way this man's feel, of his desperation. And he says he's free among the dead. If you've got a revised version, it will say cast off. It literally means to be exempt. So what does it mean? How can he be exempt as if he was among the dead? Well, someone who is dead is exempt from further trials and tribulations. So this is the point that Heman has got to. He's better off dead, really, is the way he was thinking. He just didn't want to carry on. He wanted to be free from the trials that he acknowledged that God had brought upon him. And that point is explained in the rest of the verse. For we read, he said, like the slain that lie in the grave, well, obviously not literally, whom thou rememberest no more. And that was the point. He didn't want God to remember him because God brought troubles upon him. And they are cut off from thine hand. So difficulties which may or may not be judgment can't come upon a man who's already in the grave. And that's where he wanted to be, out of reach. And so he sees his troubles in verse 6 as coming from the Father, doesn't he? Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in the darkness, in the deeps. And the lowest pit can be a well or a dungeon, and the deeps can be water or mud. And of course, that takes us straight to Jeremiah, doesn't it? Jeremiah 38, let's have a look there. Jeremiah 38, and at verse 6. Then took they Jeremiah and cast him into the dungeon of Malchijah, the son of Hamelech, that was in the court of the prison, and they let down Jeremiah with cords. And in the dungeon there was no water, but mire. So Jeremiah sunk in the mire. There was clearly no sort of civilized way in, and they didn't want to throw him in, so they let him down with these cords, and he sank into the mire. And as far as the others around him were concerned, he was as good as dead at that point. But this is how our psalmist is thinking. As we said, in the lowest pit, in the deeps. But just come to Psalm 69, please. Psalm 69, and it's all about Christ, of course, Psalm 69, but in verse 2, Christ, through the words of the psalmist, says, I sink in deep mire where there is no standing. I am come into deep waters where floods overflow me. And we might think about Christ and say, well, whenever was Christ in a pit like that, in a pit like Jeremiah? And literally, he wasn't. So what's this psalm about? Well, come into verse 15, where he picks up the same, verse 14. Verse 14, deliver me out of the mire and let me not sink. Let me be delivered from them that hate me and out of the deep waters. So that was the depth of the mire that the psalmist here is writing about, and we apply it to Christ. It's the wicked. It's let them be delivered from them that hate me and out of the deep waters. So the parallel is the hate me and the deep waters. And so this is how the psalmist felt. But in verse 7 we read, thy wrath lieth hard upon me. And that is maybe a clue that he acknowledges that God is right to place his wrath upon him. And that suggests that Heman is conscious that he has done something wrong. But we have no idea what. We aren't told. So we can take the exhortation from it as we see fit. But nevertheless, notice that it's still, as far as he is concerned, firmly in the hands of the Father. But we get another clue as to what's going on in verse 7 here. Thou hast afflicted me with all thy waves. So whatever it is that the psalmist is talking about, it wasn't a one-off event. Whatever it was that was happening to him happened over and over and over again. Either that or a series of different events. But either way, we'll not. What happens with the waves? They just keep coming, don't they? And that is how the psalmist felt. That this is what God was doing to him. Thou hast afflicted me with all thy waves. And the word wave here literally means a breaker. It's big and it's repeated. And this is how the psalmist felt. That this was what was happening to him. So just imagine standing sort of waist high in the sea, and the rollers are coming towards you, one after another. That was how this man felt because of what was happening to him. Can we just glance at Psalm 42, please? Psalm 42 and verse 7. Psalm 42 and verse 7, where we have a similar idea. Deep calleth unto deep at the noise of thy waterspouts. All thy waves and thy billows are gone over me. So here's another psalmist who likens himself to, it's almost like drowning, isn't it? But he survives. But he survives the repeated rollers coming over him. And so in verse 8, thou hast put away mine acquaintance far from me. And put away means to recede or to remove. In other words, his friends kept away. And maybe that's another little clue that it was leprosy. Or maybe it was embarrassment or distress. We don't know. Just as an aside, I'll just repeat a little story that was recounted to me. There's a sister, the sort of sister who's the life and soul of whatever's going on. There's always some sort of laughter going on with this particular sister. And something went horribly wrong in her family. So this sister, who was the joy and the laughter and so on, was a sister who was in tears. And it wasn't a one-off. It lasted for some time. And she said that she had recounted to the brethren and sisters in her ecclesia that she'd had so much fun with. She said, "You've laughed with me. Why can't you cry with me?" And that's the sort of phrase I don't think I'm ever going to forget. The fact that if someone is in great difficulties, sometimes it's hard to talk to that person. We can go and talk to somebody who's got apparently no problems and we can have a bit of fun, and that's great, that's fine. But someone who's got a real weight on their shoulders, they're the one that actually need us to talk to them. And we need to bear that in mind. It's a fantastic example of how things should be in ecclesial life. And there's so much so that in verse 8 we read there, "Thou hast made me an abomination unto them." An abomination means something disgusting. So his friends thought he was disgusting. And again, maybe that's leprosy. Maybe you can think of another explanation. Be glad to hear it afterwards. But then he says he's shut up. We're still in verse 8. We read there, "I am shut up and I cannot come forth." Again, that ties in with leprosy, doesn't it? And to shut up means to be like in prison. He can't face anybody, so he doesn't want to leave his house. Ever felt like that? I know someone in our own ecclesia who felt like that. Couldn't face going to the meeting, so she preferred to stay at home. And that's a pretty desperate situation. She's no longer in that position, I'm happy to tell you. But it can get like that, can't it? Everybody else appears to be absolutely fine, and we're the one that's got the weights of the problems. It's not like that, of course, because everybody's got problems. But it can feel like that. And as far as the psalmist is concerned, he'd got to the point where he didn't want to leave his house. We must never get to that position, brothers and sisters. That will never, ever help us. And so mine eye mourneth, we're in verse 9. Mine eye mourneth by reason of affliction. And then he says again, Yahweh, I have called upon thee. Mine eye mourneth by reason of affliction. And the eye, very interesting, isn't it, the eye? The eye, clearly we use the eye to look out, so to speak. We can see everybody else in the room. But it's also something where other people can see into our mind, can't they? We give an awful lot away in our eyes. And it kind of works both ways. The way the eyes can be used to see and used to give away sometimes our deepest feelings. And this is what's going on here in verse 9, isn't it? If anybody was able to look into his eye, they would see his afflictions. So he really reaches the depths, doesn't he, in verses 10 and 11. Wilt thou, so here's a psalmist speaking to God, wilt thou show wonders to the dead? He wants to be dead. He's had enough of all the difficulties. Shall the dead arise and praise thee? Shall thy loving kindness be declared in the grave, or thy faithfulness in destruction? Shall thy wonders be shown in the dark, and thy righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? Now, this is a challenge. Here's a man who is, he says over and again that he is in the hands of the Father. Everything is due to God. He's been taken to the point of death, in his opinion. It's the way he feels. And so he takes it another stage further. He challenges God and says, well, you can't show any of your great works to somebody who's dead. So he doesn't really want to die, is the point that we come to. He wants to be able to see God's good works. But he said, well, that can't happen if I'm destroyed. It can't happen in the land of forgetfulness. So he seems to be quite conflicted, doesn't he? Because of his difficulties, it's almost as though he wants to die, but he wants to say to God, well, come on, help me. And in that context, he goes on to say, but unto thee have I cried, O Yahweh. Notice that word but. We sometimes gloss over it, don't we? He's got these desperate circumstances in verses 10, 11 and 12. But unto thee have I cried, O Yahweh. So he hasn't lost his faith. And that's the encouragement that I get from this particular psalm. So he remains faithful. And in verse 13, and in the morning shall my prayer, we read prevent, it means meet thee, or Revised Version has come before thee. So he knows, he believes that his prayer is going to the Father and is anxiously waiting for a positive response. But in verse 13, he sort of swings back into his desperate circumstances. Yahweh, why castest thou off my soul? Why are you killing me? We might roughly paraphrase that. Why hidest thou thy face from me? And to have God hide his face from a man is a desperate circumstance. If you just come back to Numbers 6, you see the opposite effect. Numbers and chapter 6. Numbers 6, and it's the blessing, of course, but verse 24, Yahweh bless thee and keep thee. And this is the verse we want. Yahweh make his face to shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. So there's a blessing if Yahweh makes his face to shine upon thee. And what we have here is the psalmist saying, why hidest thou thy face from me? He feels as though there isn't a blessing because God has turned his face from him. And so he's back into this negative frame of mind. And he says in verse 15, I am afflicted and ready to die from my youth up. So from my youth up, there's another clue. This has been going on, whatever it is, has been going on for quite some time. Although, of course, we don't know how old he was. But to be afflicted means to be depressed in mind or circumstance. And given whatever it is that he keeps referring to in this psalm, we can understand how he has become depressed. And he desperately needs the help of the Father. And he says in verse 15, while I suffer thy terrors, I am distracted. And suffer literally means to lift. So there's a great weight upon his shoulders. And he said he was trying to lift up that weight so it was no longer bearing upon his shoulders, and distracted is to be perplexed. So up to a point, he's saying he doesn't really know why this is going on. He accepts that there is wrath. We saw that in verse 7. But the long term, he doesn't really follow what's going on. We'll come back to this point at the end, but I'd just like to think about that expression again, from my youth up. And that maybe gives us a hint that this psalm can also be messianic, which may not seem right, but bear with me and we'll have a look at it towards the end. So in verse 16 then he says, thy fierce wrath is gone over me. So again, this is the image of the waves going over his head. And it so goeth over me to cut me off. He's back in this frame of mind that he thinks God is going to kill him. And he's almost at the point where that would be better than the suffering he's going through. And he does go through it because he says in verse 17, they came, the they being the terrors of verse 16, they came round about me daily like water, they compassed me about together. So there was no let up for this man. It came daily. It's like water. So again, we're with the analogy of the waves. And they come together. They compass me about together. So the different waves of difficulties mount up because he said they compass me about together. So maybe that means that there wasn't just one thing happening. There were several things happening. Reminded me of Hezekiah when the Assyrians were coming upon Hezekiah. And of course, he got leprosy. But that was only two problems. This man has got all manner of difficulties, it would seem. And so everyone has gone from him or been taken from him. Lover and friend hast thou put far from me, and mine acquaintance into darkness. And it seems almost a strange place to stop, doesn't it? But I said at the beginning, he's laying his case to the Father, acknowledging that whatever's come upon him is in the hands of the Father. And he goes back in prayer night and day. He cries night and day to the Father. In other words, he does not lose his faith. And it's important for us, brothers and sisters, because there are times, and maybe we don't share them with everybody, when we might feel like this. I've given you a couple of examples. Sometimes we keep things in, don't we? We don't share things if we've got a difficulty. And so we need to, don't we? We need to be able to talk to one another, to help one another through whatever the difficulties are. But we go to the Father in prayer. Just for a couple of minutes, let's think about Christ. Verse 3, my soul is full of troubles. Think of Christ in Gethsemane. My life draweth nigh to the grave. Christ in Gethsemane. I'm counted with them that go down to the pit. Well, that's exactly what happened. I am as a man that hath no strength, and we think of Christ only hours away from the grave when he was suffering those dreadful so-called trials. Free among the dead, 3 days and 3 nights. Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit. Thou didst not suffer thy Holy One to see corruption. Psalm 16. Thy wrath lieth hard upon me. Thou hast afflicted me with all thy waves. Not because of what he had done, but because he was a representative of all mankind and of you and I. Verse 8, thou hast put away mine acquaintance from me. Thou hast made me an abomination unto them. And of all the hundreds of people that surrounded him during the 3.5 years of his ministry, there were very few at the foot of the accursed tree. I am shut up and cannot come forth 3 days and 3 nights. But because he was there for 3 days and 3 nights, and because he was resurrected, we have a wonderful and glorious hope. We do have a heavenly Father who does care for us. Yes, there are trials and tribulations. Yes, they might be hard for us to bear, but the whole point is we've been made fit for the kingdom. And we hope and we pray that the lessons that we have learned from Heman, the Ezrahite, can encourage us when there are times of difficulties to look forward, to pray to our Heavenly Father, and to look forward to the glories of the kingdom age.